Hi everyone, my name's Diane Purkiss and I'm a professor of English at the University of Oxford. You might be thinking at this point that I look really strange and that this room in my house is really strange. If that's the case, marvelous, because it means you're thinking about me exactly the way that Emily Bronte's students in Brussels thought about her. They laughed at her a lot because her clothes were so old-fashioned. And finally, she turned to a group of them who were snickering and said, "I am as God made me." She refused to change her style of dress just because they thought it was old-fashioned and funny. There's a bit of Emily Bronte in all of us, and I think that's what draws us back to her one published novel, Wuthering Heights. When Wuthering Heights was published, it was not a huge success right away. Reviewers were horrified by what they described as its coarse tone, and they were equally horrified by the extremes of passion that it dramatized. And they started to speculate about what kind of person might have written a book so savage. One thing that obviously led them astray was that Emily had chosen to publish Wuthering Heights under a pen name that was deliberately chosen to be ambiguous in gender. She chose the pen name Ellis Bell, and so lots of the early readers of Wuthering Heights guessed that it had been written by a man, and they felt a man with very dubious morals. This was obviously really comic in a way, in that Emily was a vicar's daughter. She didn't really have an exciting or exotic background. She hadn't had a romantic life. And ever since Wuthering Heights was printed, biographers have spent a lot of time and energy wondering why this quiet, strangely dressed, eccentric woman who loved dogs and loved the moors would have written a novel so incredibly strongly passionate. There is a reason, and the reason is not just the simple one that Emily made it up. It's that Wuthering Heights itself has a past, and that past has now been uncovered by generations of scholars. What they've discovered is that, a bit like J.R.R. Tolkien, Emily Bronte had invented an imaginary world for herself. She first invented it as quite a little girl, in childhood even, and she invented it as part of a let's pretend game that she played with her brother, Bramwell, and her two sisters, Charlotte and Anne. And the Let's Pretend game started when they got a box of toy soldiers as a gift from their father. And each of them named a toy soldier and took that toy soldier as their own. And they started making up stories about these toy soldiers. The first story they made up was that they, the Bronte children, were enormous godlike figures, and the toy soldiers were tiny little people living in a tiny, tiny little world. And that set of ideas became the basis for a very complicated and, in many respects, very adult and very sophisticated pair of worlds that the Bronte children went on to create, and that they went on developing and developing and developing and writing about into their 20s and early 30s. And there were really two worlds. There was Charlotte and Bramwell's world of Angria, which was a sophisticated 18th century society with lots of glamorous ladies in low-cut dresses going to balls. And then there was the world that Emily and Anne created, which was called Gondal. It was set on an island in the North Pacific. The Gondal people were a bit like Highlanders. Emily really liked the writings of Walter Scott, so she tried to imagine, and Anne helped her imagine, a world of exciting political rebellions, with people taking to the heather and hiding out, as real Scots had done after Bonnie Prince Charlie's uprising had ended in failure. And the Gondal world was ruled by a woman. a woman called Augusta Geraldina Almeida, who was very beautiful, and everyone who met her fell in love with her. And she was incredibly glamorous, but she was also cruel and horrible, a bit like Cersei Lannister, if you've seen Game of Thrones. And the men who were in love with her mostly felt thwarted and bitter and jealous, and they tended to die terrible deaths. Gondal has a very, very high death rate. In that way, it's a bit like Game of Thrones too. A lot of the intrigues end badly for the people involved in them. But Emily wrote dozens and dozens of really very remarkable poems about the people of Gondal. And I'm just going to try and show you through screen sharing what some of those poems look like. So what you're seeing here is one of Emily's poems in her own handwriting. It's massively larger on a screen than you would guess. It was this little fragment that I'm showing you now is 2 inches by 3 inches. So if you measure it with your fingers, it's about that by that, really tiny. And it's written in incredibly tiny and very strange writing. It's written in this way, not because Emily's handwriting was rubbish. Emily had beautiful handwriting when she felt like she could do gorgeous copperplate, but she didn't do her poetry writing like that. She always did it in tiny little sort of block capitals. And there was a reason for that. In fact, I'm going to suggest to you that there were 2 reasons for that. One was that the poems she was writing and the history of Gondal she was writing were appropriately sized for the tiny tin soldiers that were Gondal's original residents. Both Emily and Charlotte ended up creating tiny little books, smaller than something that could be held between my 2 fingers. And those tiny little books were created for the people that they called the young men, that was the tin soldiers. And in the books was writing that was also really tiny, that they did with nib pens. And you can see that the writing is designed to resemble print. That's right. It's designed to resemble typefaces. Now, why would you write in a way that kind of reminds you of type? Well, one reason that you might write in that way is so that it looks like a book. And one of the things we know about Emily's poetry, and there's a lot of it, and some of it is really beautiful and remarkable as poetry. One of the things we know about Emily's poetry is that she had no intention whatsoever of publishing it. And increasingly, she didn't show it to her sister Charlotte either. But what happened was that Charlotte came across a notebook full of Emily's poetry one day when, and this sounds like such a big excuse to me, accidentally rummaging in Emily's writing desk. All the Brontes had these beautiful writing desks. They're really enviable and gorgeous. I hope you can see this picture here. Basically, what they're like is like themselves a bit like a book. And you write on the slope bit, and inside you can keep all your papers. So Charlotte was rummaging in Emily's writing desk, which she obviously had absolutely no business to touch. And if you live with sisters or brothers, you know that it's sacrosanct to respect one another's property. Well, Charlotte didn't take it as sacrosanct. She had a rummage, and she came across a notebook full of Emily's poetry. And she, Charlotte, decided that it was really great poetry. So immediately she conceived the ambition that she should add some of her poems and that Anne should add some of her poems and that the 3 of them should publish their poems together. This was really, and there's no nice way of putting this, Charlotte piggybacking off Emily's poems to start a literary career for herself. Charlotte's poems are significantly worse than Emily's, though she's a very, very good novelist eventually. And she clearly wanted a kind of leg up into the literary world using Emily's ability. Emily, on the other hand, was absolutely furious with her and really never forgave her, and for days and days wouldn't speak to her, while Charlotte pleaded and begged that they could have their poems published. And finally, Emily, who probably felt that her privacy had already been violated by Charlotte, agreed to have them published. And the very few reviews that they did get said that Emily's poems were the best. And we know that Emily did care about that because she kept the reviews. So then Charlotte, dissatisfied with the reception of the poems, decided that the three of them, she, Emily, and Anne, should write novels, and that all the novels should be published together in what was called a triple decker. Most Victorian novels were published in 3 volumes. The Victorians mostly read their novels not by going to the shop and buying them, but by borrowing them from what were called circulating libraries, and all those circulating libraries were privately owned. So circulating libraries liked 3-volume works. It drew people back in to borrow 3 books instead of 1. And so as a result, Charlotte, to cater for that market, decided again that the 3 of them could act together. And so she wrote a novel called The Professor. Emily wrote Wuthering Heights, and Anne wrote Agnes Grey. Now, the interesting thing here is that Emily wrote Wuthering Heights incredibly quickly, really, really fast. And that passionate central relationship in Wuthering Heights between Heathcliff and Cathy, a relationship that most biographers find it very difficult to understand in terms of what we know about Emily's life, is very close to the kinds of romantic relationships that Emily had already depicted in the Gondal saga. And we can see this particularly clearly by looking at just one of the Gondal poems. And it's one called Remembrance. It should be visible on your screen, but you can find lots of copies of it on the internet. And what's interesting about it from the point of view of Wuthering Heights is that it depicts passionate love directed by somebody deeply saddened by being bereaved of their lover, looking down at their lover in the grave and almost dreaming of being reunited with them in the grave, in a way that's really very proleptic of the kinds of things that Heathcliff finds to say at the grave of Cathy. The idea of the tomb as this sort of space where love can finally be fully expressed in a way it couldn't be in life is already present in this poem. So yeah, I strongly invite you to explore that poem for yourself. It's a wonderful poem. It's also an immensely strong poem. All of Emily's lyric poems, they're not kind of pretty. Even when she notices things on the moors, very much like Cathy and Heathcliff, what she values is what 9 people out of 10 might think about as their scary qualities. A lot of her poems deal with ghosts and the supernatural and people feeling haunted, particularly by what they know to be bad deeds. So all those little themes that crop up in Wuthering Heights, the power of the moors, the power of nature, the stoicism of the human characters are already present in the Gondal saga. Now, Emily basically lived her entire imaginative life in that world. She and Anne were still pretending to be fleeing Gondal rebels when they were nearly 30, actually the year before they both died, on a long, boring journey to York. Journeys took a long time in the 19th century, and you had to find something to do with the time. So, I mean, this remained dominant in Emily's imagination. Her imagination was nurtured by this incredibly elaborate paracosm that she'd created in all its splendor and tragedy and mystery and darkness. It had always been quite an adult kind of space with lots of romance and lots of intrigue and lots of politics and lots of death, more like Game of Thrones than like Lord of the Rings. And it was from that imaginary universe that she was able really quickly to scribble down Wuthering Heights. Now, Wuthering Heights wasn't very well reviewed, but what then happened was that Emily and the whole family had a stupendous stroke of luck in that Charlotte's second novel, Jane Eyre, was a huge runaway bestseller. And if you think of what it's like to see bestsellers where every single bookshop has dozens of copies of like 50 Shades of Grey or J.K. Rowling's latest or whatever it is, you'll notice how everyone then tends to want to get onto the bandwagon. And that's what happened with the Bronte sisters. Emily's Wuthering Heights publisher actually reissued Wuthering Heights and tried to pretend that it was by Charlotte, which was pretty dodgy. But it did mean that he asked for another novel from Emily, and we know she wrote another novel because there's a surviving letter from her to her editor showing that she wrote another novel. So the difficult question becomes, what became of that other novel? Either Emily herself destroyed it, or after her death, Charlotte did, because actually Charlotte by then had decided that these imaginative worlds were bad for the moral character, that letting yourself dream about Angria with lots of passionate rakes and ladies in low-cut dresses wasn't suitable, wasn't acceptable behavior, and that its addictive properties illustrated just how morally bad it was. It's therefore quite likely that in one way or another, it's Charlotte who destroyed Emily's second novel or encouraged Emily to do so. So a thing to bear in mind is the possibility that the Brontes themselves wrestled with this dark imaginative realm that they themselves had created. And we can certainly see a lot of that wrestling going on in Charlotte's work. Even though Emily doesn't really wrestle with it much, she kind of gives way to it. And that's a good way to delineate the difference between Charlotte's work and Emily's. I hope you've enjoyed this encounter with Emily Bronte and her strange miniature world. And I hope you also enjoy rereading Wuthering Heights in the light of that knowledge. If you do have any questions, my email address is very easy to find on the Oxford website. My name is Diane Purkiss, and if you just type the name Purkiss in, I'm one of only a few, and the only one whose beginning initial is D. So do get in touch if you have questions, and in the meantime, enjoy reading. Bye.